In 1932, a teacher in a public school in Chicago opened her classroom door at lunchtime and watched her students do what they did every day. Some of them pulled sandwiches from paper bags. Some of them ate crackers they had brought from home. Some of them ate nothing at all because there was nothing to bring and no money to buy anything, and they sat at their desks for the lunch period staring at the wall while their wealthier classmates ate. The teacher knew which children had not eaten breakfast. She had learned to recognize the signs: the difficulty concentrating in morning lessons, the irritability, the pallor, the children who fell asleep at their desks by 10 in the morning. She kept crackers in her desk drawer and gave them out quietly when she could, trying not to embarrass the children who needed them, knowing that the crackers were not enough and that there was nothing systematic she could do about the problem. What she was observing was not unusual. It was the ordinary condition of poor children in American schools throughout the Depression, and it had been the ordinary condition of poor children in American schools long before the Depression began. Children who came to school hungry could not learn effectively. Children who came to school malnourished had health problems that affected their ability to attend school and to benefit from instruction when they did attend. This was known, it was documented, and it was not addressed by any federal program until 1946. The National School Lunch Act, signed by President Harry Truman on June 4, 1946, established the first permanent federal program providing funding to schools to serve subsidized lunches to children. It was the first time the federal government formally acknowledged that ensuring children had something to eat at school was a national responsibility rather than a local or family matter. Before 1946, what happened at lunchtime in American schools depended entirely on where you lived, what your school district could afford, and what your family had. For children in wealthy families and well-funded school districts, the answer was a lunch brought from home or purchased from a school cafeteria. For children in poor families and underfunded school districts, the answer was often nothing. This is the story of what children ate and what they did not eat before the federal school lunch program existed. It is the story of the hunger that was visible in American classrooms for decades, before anyone in Washington decided it was worth addressing. It is the story of the political forces that finally produced the 1946 Act, including some forces that had nothing to do with children's welfare. And it is the story of what the school lunch program has become in the 78 years since it was established, including the gaps that have always existed in its coverage and the ongoing debates about what children should be eating and who should pay for it. To understand what school lunch meant before 1946, you need to understand the American school system of the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the role that food played, or did not play, in it. The American public school system in 1900 was primarily a morning and afternoon institution. Schools typically ran from roughly 8 in the morning to 3 or 4 in the afternoon, with a midday break that was not formally part of the school program. Students were expected to go home for lunch if they lived close enough, or to bring food from home if they did not. The school had no formal responsibility for feeding students during the day. This model reflected the social assumptions of the era. The middle-class family around which the school system was designed had a mother at home who could prepare lunch for children who came home at noon and who could pack a lunch for children who could not. The working class and poor families for whom this assumption was less accurate were not the primary constituency of a school system that was still in the early decades of universal public education. The industrialization and urbanization of the late 19th century changed the context in which schools operated. As more families moved to cities and as more mothers entered the paid workforce, the assumption that a parent was available to provide lunch became less reliable. Urban schools that served large numbers of working-class children began encountering the lunch problem systematically. Children who had no food at noon, who were hungry throughout the afternoon, and who showed signs of malnutrition that affected their ability to benefit from instruction. The settlement house movement, which brought middle-class reformers to live and work in urban poor neighborhoods, documented these conditions in detail. Jane Addams and her colleagues at Hull House in Chicago observed the nutrition problems of the children in their neighborhood and began providing meals as part of their broader community service. Ellen Richards, a chemist who pioneered the home economics movement, established one of the first school lunch programs in Boston in 1894, providing inexpensive hot lunches to students at the Barnard School. These early school lunch programs were private charitable initiatives, funded by philanthropy and run by volunteers, that addressed the problem in individual schools without any systematic framework or public funding. They demonstrated that the problem was real and that organized lunch provision could address it, but they reached only a small fraction of the children who needed help. The first systematic effort to address school nutrition at the policy level came from the progressive reformers of the early 20th century, who were documenting the connections between poverty, malnutrition, and educational outcomes with increasing precision. The research showed what teachers already knew from daily observation. Children who were not adequately nourished performed worse in school, had higher rates of illness and absence, and were less likely to complete their education. The argument for school lunch programs that progressive reformers made was framed primarily in terms of educational efficiency and national productivity, rather than in terms of children's welfare or social justice. A school system that was investing public money in educating children was getting a poor return on that investment if the children it was trying to educate were too hungry to learn. Feeding children was not charity, the reformers argued. It was an investment in the productivity of the educational system and in the future economic capacity of the country. This framing was important because it made the argument for school lunch politically more appealing to conservative politicians who were skeptical of welfare programs, but who supported efficiency and investment in human capital. Feeding children so they could learn was not socialism. It was practical education policy. This argument would be deployed again and again in the debates over school lunch in the following decades with varying degrees of success. The Great Depression transformed the school lunch landscape in a way that was both helpful and revealing. The federal government's agricultural surplus disposal programs, which were designed primarily to support farm prices by removing surplus commodities from the market, began directing surplus food to schools in the 1930s. The Works Progress Administration, the New Deal Employment Program, funded workers to prepare and serve food in school cafeterias. These programs reached millions of children who had no other reliable source of a midday meal during the worst years of the Depression. The Depression-era programs illustrated both the potential of federal involvement in school feeding and the specific political dynamics that would shape federal school lunch policy for decades. The agriculture surplus disposal dimension was critical. The farm lobby, which was one of the most powerful political forces in Washington, supported school lunch programs because they provided a market for surplus agricultural products. Children's welfare was a secondary consideration from the farm lobby's perspective. What mattered was that school lunch programs consumed surplus commodities that would otherwise depress farm prices. This alignment of interests between the farm lobby and child welfare advocates was the political foundation on which the National School Lunch Act of 1946 was built. The act was as much an agricultural price support program as a child nutrition program, and this dual character has shaped federal school lunch policy ever since. The specific legislative history of the 1946 Act reflects this dual character. The primary sponsors of the bill were not advocates for poor children, but agricultural committee members who wanted a permanent mechanism for disposing of surplus farm commodities. The child nutrition advocates who had been pushing for school lunch legislation since the early 20th century supported the bill, but were not driving it. The result was a program that served children's nutritional needs as a byproduct of its primary function of supporting farm prices. The National School Lunch Act established a federal reimbursement system in which the federal government paid participating schools a small amount per lunch served, with higher reimbursements for lunches served to low-income children who could not afford to pay full price. Schools that participated in the program were required to serve lunches that met minimum nutritional standards and to make lunches available at reduced or no cost to children who could not afford them. The program was voluntary for schools, which meant that participation depended on individual school districts choosing to participate and meeting the program's administrative requirements. Schools that chose to participate received federal reimbursements and commodity foods from the federal government's surplus disposal programs. Schools that did not choose to participate received nothing and had no obligation to serve lunch at all. This voluntary structure, which has characterized the school lunch program throughout its history, meant that the program's reach was always limited by the decisions of individual school districts. Districts in affluent areas, where most students could afford to pay full price for lunch and where the administrative burden of the federal program was not offset by sufficient federal funding, sometimes chose not to participate. Districts in poor areas, where federal subsidies were most important, sometimes lacked the cafeteria infrastructure or the administrative capacity to participate effectively. The children who were most in need of the program, those in the poorest communities with the least adequate school infrastructure, were sometimes the least well served by it. This paradox, in which a program designed to help poor children was less effective in the poorest communities than in wealthier ones, reflected the structural limitations of a voluntary program administered through local institutions. The gap between children who were reached by the school lunch program and children who were not was significant throughout the program's early decades. In the 1960s, civil rights investigators who were documenting poverty in the rural South found children who were attending schools with no cafeteria, no lunch program, and no alternative to going hungry from breakfast until they returned home in the afternoon. These were often the same children who were already disadvantaged by the underfunded, segregated school systems that served black children in the South. The Child Nutrition Act of 1966 expanded the federal commitment to school nutrition, adding the school breakfast program as a pilot program that would eventually become permanent, and increasing federal reimbursements for lunches served to low-income children. The breakfast program was a response to research showing that children who had not eaten before school arrived at their classrooms in a state of hunger that severely impaired their ability to benefit from morning instruction. The connection between breakfast, cognitive function, and academic performance was well established in the nutritional science of the era, and the research provided a compelling argument for extending the federal feeding program from lunch to breakfast. The political battle over school lunch in the 1970s produced one of the most consequential and most criticized regulatory decisions in the history of the program. The Nixon administration, facing budget pressure, reduced the income threshold for free and reduced-price lunches, removing eligibility from children in working-class families who were above the official poverty line but who could not realistically afford full-price lunches. The cuts produced a political backlash that was significant enough to produce a reversal. But the episode illustrated the vulnerability of the program to budget-cutting pressures that would recur in subsequent administrations. The Reagan administration's 1981 budget cuts to the school lunch program produced the most famous controversy in the program's history. The administration proposed a series of cost-cutting measures, including changes to the commodity foods that schools received and revisions to the portion sizes and nutritional requirements for lunches. One of the proposed regulatory changes would have classified ketchup and pickle relish as vegetables for the purpose of meeting the vegetable requirements in school lunch menus. The ketchup as vegetable proposal was withdrawn after it became a national news story and a target of mockery. But the broader budget cuts that accompanied it were not withdrawn, and they reduced both the number of children who qualified for free and reduced-price lunches and the quality of the meals that were served. The episode illustrated the tension between the program's child nutrition goals and the budget pressures that have consistently pushed toward reducing its cost. The nutritional quality of school lunches has been a persistent concern throughout the program's history. The minimum nutritional standards established by the 1946 Act were based on the nutritional science of the era, which emphasized adequate calories, protein, and certain vitamins and minerals. As nutritional science evolved and as the understanding of diet and health changed, the standards required updating, and the updating process was always contentious. The Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, signed by President Obama and driven significantly by First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, made the most substantial revisions to school lunch nutritional standards since the program's establishment. The act required schools to increase the amount of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains in school lunches, reduce sodium, and ensure that lunches met updated nutritional guidelines. The revisions were based on solid nutritional science and were intended to address the epidemic of childhood obesity that had developed in the preceding decades. The implementation of the new standards was controversial. School districts that had been serving meals designed primarily to be palatable to children found that the new standards required significant changes to menus and food preparation. Some students resisted the healthier options and either did not eat the lunch or brought food from home that was less healthy than the school lunch. Food waste increased in some schools as students discarded the fruits and vegetables they were required to take but did not want to eat. The Trump administration rolled back some of the Obama-era standards in 2018 and 2020, allowing schools more flexibility in the sodium and whole grain requirements. The Biden administration subsequently moved to strengthen the standards again. The back and forth reflected the ongoing political contestation over school lunch nutritional standards, between those who prioritize nutritional quality and those who prioritize palatability, cost, and local control. The COVID-19 pandemic produced the most significant temporary expansion of the school lunch program in its history. When schools closed in March 2020, the federal government authorized school districts to provide free meals to all children, regardless of income, through curbside pickup and other alternative distribution mechanisms. The authorization was accompanied by increased federal reimbursements that allowed schools to serve free meals to all students without losing money on the program. The pandemic-era universal free school lunch, which was in effect from 2020 through the end of the 2021-22 school year, provided a natural experiment in what universal free school lunch looked like in practice. Participation rates increased. Administrative burden on schools and families decreased, because there was no need to apply for free or reduced-price meal eligibility or to collect payment from paying students. Food insecurity among school-age children decreased, and the stigma associated with receiving free lunch, which had been a persistent concern in discussions of school nutrition programs, was eliminated because everyone was receiving the same meal on the same terms. The evidence from the pandemic-era universal free lunch was sufficiently positive that a number of states, including California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Vermont, chose to continue providing universal free school lunch using state funds after the federal authorization expired. These states made a judgment that the administrative simplicity, the improved participation rates, the reduced stigma, and the nutritional benefits of universal free lunch outweighed the additional cost compared to a means-tested program. The federal program returned to its means-tested structure in the 2022-23 school year, meaning that students who did not qualify for free or reduced-price meals were again required to pay full price for school lunch. The transition back to the means-tested system revealed a problem that had been partially obscured during the pandemic: unpaid school meal debt. Students whose families had income above the free and reduced price meal threshold but who could not actually afford to pay for school lunch were accumulating debt on their lunch accounts, and some school districts were implementing policies that humiliated or punished students whose accounts were in arrears. The practice of lunch shaming, in which students with unpaid balances were refused a hot meal and given a cold peanut butter sandwich or a carton of milk instead, or were required to eat in a designated area away from their peers, or had a stamp placed on their arm indicating debt, attracted national attention when specific incidents were reported. The practice was cruel, was documented to be ineffective at collecting debt, and created exactly the kind of stigma and humiliation around school lunch that the program had been designed to eliminate. Several states passed legislation prohibiting lunch shaming after these incidents received media attention. The issue highlighted the fundamental tension in a means-tested school lunch program between the administrative requirements of identifying eligible students and collecting payment from ineligible ones, and the goal of ensuring that every child has access to a nutritious meal at school without stigma or humiliation. The argument for universal free school lunch, which has gained significant policy attention since the pandemic experience, rests on several converging arguments. The administrative simplicity of a universal program reduces overhead for schools and eliminates the eligibility determination process that families must navigate. The elimination of the distinction between free and paid lunch eliminates the stigma associated with receiving free lunch. The improved participation rates that universal programs produce increase the nutritional benefit of the program by reaching more children. And the economic benefit to families of eliminating lunch costs, which can run to several $100s per child per year at full price rates, is significant for working-class families who are above the income threshold for free or reduced-price meals but who find lunch costs a genuine financial burden. The cost of universal free school lunch at the federal level, estimated at approximately $15 billion per year above current program costs, is significant but not large in the context of the federal budget. The question is whether the political will exists to fund a universal program when a means-tested program addresses the most acute cases of food insecurity at lower cost. The children who sat in the Chicago classroom in 1932 eating nothing while their classmates ate sandwiches are the beginning of this history. The children who sat in the cafeteria in 2022 eating a cold peanut butter sandwich while their classmates ate hot lunch because their family owed money to the school are not far from the end of it. The distance between those two moments is the distance that 78 years of federal school lunch policy has traveled, and it is not as far as it should be. From the hungry children in the Chicago classroom in 1932 to the National School Lunch Act in 1946. From the means-tested program to the pandemic-era universal free lunch. From the lunch shaming of 2022 to the states that chose universal free lunch to prevent it. That is the history of school lunch in America. The program is real and has fed hundreds of millions of children. The gaps are also real and have left millions of children hungry at their desks. And the debate about what the program should be, who it should serve, and on what terms, is as alive in 2025 as it was in 1946. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. To understand the full human dimension of what hunger in school actually meant for children before 1946, you need to go beyond the Chicago classroom and into the specific research that documented the relationship between nutrition and learning that progressive reformers were building in the early 20th century. The connection between hunger and cognitive function is not a modern discovery. Teachers and doctors who worked with poor children in the late 19th and early 20th centuries observed it directly and described it in terms that would be recognizable to any contemporary educator. Children who had not eaten, could not concentrate, were irritable and difficult, fell asleep in class, and retained nothing from instruction. These were not lazy or inattentive children, they were hungry children. The research that quantified these observations was conducted at institutions like Teachers College at Columbia University, and at various state normal schools where education researchers were trying to understand the factors that affected educational outcomes. The studies consistently found that children who received adequate nutrition showed significantly better academic performance than comparable children who did not, even when other factors like family income and parental education were controlled for. One particularly influential study, conducted in Edinburgh, Scotland in the 1880s by a physician named W.L. Cameron, provided children from poor families with a midday meal and measured the effect on their school attendance, attentiveness, and academic achievement. The results showed improvements on all three measures that were significant enough to attract international attention, including from American researchers who were looking for evidence to support the case for school feeding programs. The American social reformer Robert Hunter, whose 1904 book Poverty documented the extent of destitution in American cities, estimated that approximately 60,000 to 70,000 children in New York City alone were coming to school hungry on any given school day. Hunter's estimate was probably conservative, given the scale of poverty in the city at the time and the inadequacy of the charitable programs that existed to address it. The actual number of hungry children in American schools in the early 20th century was certainly in the hundreds of thousands and possibly in the millions. These children were not invisible. Their teachers saw them every day. The school nurses and physicians who were beginning to be employed by urban school systems in the early 20th century examined them and documented their nutritional deficiencies. The settlement house workers who visited their homes saw the conditions under which they lived. The problem was not lack of awareness, it was lack of political will to address it. The political will that was lacking reflected the dominant ideology of the era, which treated poverty and its consequences primarily as individual moral failures rather than as social and structural problems requiring collective solutions. Children who came to school hungry were children whose families had failed to provide adequately for them, and the appropriate response was private charity and moral uplift rather than public programs that might undermine the incentive to self-sufficiency. This ideology was not universal, and it was challenged by the progressive reformers who were documenting the structural causes of poverty and the inadequacy of private charity to address them. But it was influential enough to prevent the systematic public response to child hunger that the evidence clearly warranted for several decades. The Philadelphia School Lunch Program, which began in 1894 when the school board contracted with a women's organization to provide lunches to students at one elementary school, was one of the first publicly funded school lunch programs in the United States. The program spread gradually to other Philadelphia schools over the following decades, always operating on the margin of the school budget and always vulnerable to the budget cuts that came during economic downturns. The New York City School Lunch Program, which began as a charitable initiative in the 1890s and was eventually incorporated into the public school system, provided a larger-scale example of what systematic school feeding could look like. By the 1910s, New York City was serving hundreds of thousands of school lunches annually through a combination of school cafeterias and contract arrangements with private caterers. The program was administered by the Board of Education and funded primarily through student payments with subsidies for children who could not pay. The New York program was frequently cited as a model in national discussions of school feeding, and it illustrated both the potential of systematic school lunch programs and their limitations. The program reached children in New York City, where there was sufficient population density and institutional capacity to make it work, but it had no relevance to children in rural areas where schools were small and scattered, where cafeteria infrastructure did not exist, and where the administrative capacity for a school feeding program was entirely absent. The rural school lunch problem was arguably more severe than the urban one, even though it was less visible. Urban poverty was concentrated and observable in ways that attracted reformers and researchers. Rural poverty, particularly in the South and in Appalachia, was dispersed and hidden from the reformers who were primarily based in cities. The rural children who came to school hungry were coming to one-room schoolhouses where the teacher had no crackers in her desk and no cafeteria to send them to, where the community had no charitable organizations providing meals, and where the family's poverty meant that there was simply nothing to send with the child to school. The documentation of rural school hunger that did exist, produced primarily by public health investigators who traveled through rural areas in the 1920s and 1930s, found rates of malnutrition that were alarming. In some rural counties in the South, investigators found that significant majorities of school-age children showed signs of nutritional deficiency, including stunted growth, dental decay from inadequate nutrition, anemia, and the kind of cognitive impairment that chronic hunger and malnutrition produce. These children were not simply poor. They were hungry in ways that had permanent consequences for their physical and cognitive development, consequences that would affect their ability to learn, to work, and to participate fully in economic and social life as adults. The hunger they experienced in childhood was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a developmental injury that shaped the rest of their lives. Understanding this context is essential for understanding the significance of the 1946 Act and for understanding why its limitations matter. A program that reached urban school children with cafeteria infrastructure but did not reach rural children in one-room schoolhouses was addressing part of the problem while leaving another part unaddressed. a program that provided subsidized lunches to children who qualified for free and reduced-price meals but left children in working-class families above the income threshold without adequate food was addressing part of the problem while leaving another part unaddressed. The specific children who fell through the gaps of the school lunch program have always been the children most in need of its protection. The poorest children in the poorest communities. The most isolated rural children. The children whose families were just above the income threshold for subsidized meals but who still could not afford to eat adequately. These are the children for whom the gap between what the program promises and what it delivers has been most consequential. The school breakfast program, which was established as a pilot in 1966 and made permanent in 1975, addressed one dimension of this gap by extending the federal feeding commitment from lunch to the meal that nutritional research had identified as most critical for cognitive function during the school day. The research on breakfast and learning was consistent and compelling. Children who ate breakfast showed better concentration, better memory, better problem-solving ability, and better academic performance than children who did not, even when other factors were controlled for. The breakfast program grew slowly in its early years, partly because of the infrastructure required to serve breakfast before school, and partly because of the additional cost relative to serving only lunch. But it eventually became a significant component of the school nutrition program, reaching millions of children who might otherwise arrive at school without having eaten since the previous day. The summer meal program, which provides meals to children in low-income areas during the summer months when school is not in session, addresses another dimension of the gap: the fact that children who depend on school meals for adequate nutrition face food insecurity during the summer when those meals are not available. The summer program has always been significantly smaller and less well-funded than the school year programs, reaching a much smaller fraction of the eligible children. The summer hunger problem is particularly acute because it is invisible in the way that school year hunger is not. During the school year, a teacher can observe a hungry child and take action, even if the action is limited. During the summer, hungry children are dispersed across communities with no systematic way to identify them or reach them. The summer meal program attempts to address this through fixed meal sites in libraries, parks, community centers, and other locations where children can receive meals, but the logistics of reaching children who may live far from the meal sites and whose parents may not have transportation remain challenging. The child nutrition programs that have developed since 1946, the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program, the Summer Food Service Program, the Child and Adult Care Food Program for childcare settings, represent a significant and growing federal commitment to ensuring that children have access to adequate nutrition. The total federal expenditure on child nutrition programs has grown from a small fraction of the federal budget in 1946 to approximately $20 billion annually in 2025. This investment has had measurable effects on child nutrition, on school attendance, and on academic performance. Studies consistently find that children who participate in school meal programs have better nutritional status, lower rates of food insecurity, and better academic outcomes than comparable children who do not. The investment has been one of the more cost-effective domestic policy interventions in the federal budget, producing benefits in child health, educational outcomes, and long-term economic productivity that significantly exceed the direct cost of the meals served. But the investment has not been sufficient to eliminate child hunger or food insecurity in the United States. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that approximately 13 million children live in food-insecure households, meaning households where access to adequate food is uncertain. These children are not all hungry every day, but they experience periods of food insecurity that affect their health, their development, and their educational outcomes. The school nutrition programs reach most of these children during the school year, providing at least one reliable meal per school day, but they do not reach them in the evenings, on weekends, during school vacations, or during the summer. They do not reach children and families above the income threshold for subsidized meals who nonetheless face food insecurity, and they do not provide the family-level food security that would ensure adequate nutrition for the child's full development rather than just their school day nutrition. The teacher in Chicago in 1932 who kept crackers in her desk drawer was doing what she could with what she had. The National School Lunch Act of 1946 gave her a better answer to the problem she was seeing every day. The pandemic-era universal free lunch gave an even better answer. The lunch shaming of 2022 suggested that the progress has not been uniform or consistent. Understanding the full history of school lunch in America, from the hungry children in the progressive era to the universal free lunch of the pandemic years to the ongoing debates about means testing and stigma and nutritional standards, is essential for understanding both how far the country has come and how far it still has to go in ensuring that every child has access to adequate nutrition during the school day. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The international comparison provides useful context for understanding where the American school lunch program stands, relative to what other wealthy countries have built. Most wealthy countries provide school meals on a universal basis, without income testing, as a standard component of the educational system. In Finland, which consistently produces among the best educational outcomes in the world by international measures, free school lunch for all students has been a universal entitlement since 1948, 2 years after the American National School Lunch Act was passed. Finnish school lunches are required to meet specific nutritional standards and are provided to all students from primary school through secondary education as a right, not as a means-tested benefit. Sweden, Norway, and Estonia also provide universal free school meals. India, which is a much poorer country than the United States, launched a universal school midday meal program in 1995 that now feeds approximately 120 million children daily, the largest school feeding program in the world by number of beneficiaries. Brazil's national school feeding program provides meals to all students in public schools, with specific nutritional requirements and requirements that a significant fraction of the food be sourced from local family farmers. These international examples suggest that universal school feeding is not a utopian ideal, but a practical policy that many countries have implemented successfully. The American approach, with its means-tested structure, its eligibility determination process, its income-based differentiation between free, reduced-price, and full-price meals, and its vulnerability to budget cuts and political contestation, is not the only possible approach. It is the approach that the specific political history of the United States, with its emphasis on means testing, local control, and resistance to universal benefits, has produced. The countries that provide universal free school meals do not appear to suffer the negative consequences that opponents of universal programs in the United States typically predict. The elimination of meal charges does not appear to reduce the incentive for parents to provide food for their children. The provision of universal benefits does not appear to undermine the work ethic or self-sufficiency of the families who receive them. The educational outcomes in countries with universal school meals are generally better than in the United States, not worse. This does not prove that universal free school lunch in the United States would produce the same outcomes as in Finland or Sweden, because many other differences between these countries affect educational outcomes. But it does establish that universal school feeding is a viable policy that has been implemented successfully in a range of national contexts, and that the specific features of the American system, means testing, income-based differentiation, and the stigma that accompanies targeted programs are not necessary features of a federal school lunch commitment. The school lunch debate in the United States in 2025 is largely a debate between those who believe that the means-tested structure of the current program is appropriate and fiscally responsible, targeting federal resources toward the children most in need, and those who believe that a universal program would produce better outcomes for children at a cost that is worth paying for the simplicity, the elimination of stigma, and the improved participation rates that universality would produce. The evidence from the pandemic-era universal free lunch, and from the states that have continued universal programs since the federal authorization expired, supports the case for universality on nutritional, administrative, and equity grounds. The political obstacles to a federal universal program are primarily fiscal, reflecting the additional cost of approximately $15 billion annually, and ideological, reflecting the American political culture's preference for targeted benefits over universal ones. Whether those obstacles will be overcome depends on the political conditions that are being created right now by the states that are implementing universal programs and demonstrating their feasibility, by the advocates who are documenting the harms of means testing and stigma, and by the broader conversation about child hunger and food insecurity that the pandemic experience reopened in ways that have not yet fully closed. The teacher in Chicago in 1932 who kept crackers in her desk drawer was practicing a form of emergency universality. She gave food to the children who needed it without asking them to prove eligibility or charging them for what she provided. Her approach was right. The challenge is scaling it to a federal program that reaches every child in every school in the country on the same terms. From the hungry children in the Chicago classroom in 1932, to the National School Lunch Act in 1946, to the pandemic-era universal free lunch in 2020, to the states that chose to continue it, to the federal debate about whether to make it permanent. That is the history. And the children who are hungry in American classrooms today deserve a better answer than the means-tested, stigma-producing, administratively burdensome program that the 1946 Act established. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. There is one final dimension of this history that deserves careful attention before we close. It is the dimension of who benefits from the current school lunch system and who bears its costs, and whether the distribution of benefits and costs reflects the program's stated goals. The stated goal of the National School Lunch Program is to ensure that all children have access to a nutritious meal during the school day, with particular attention to children who could not otherwise afford one. This is a straightforward and admirable goal. The question is whether the current program achieves it. The children who receive the greatest benefit from the current program are the children who qualify for free meals, whose families have incomes at or below 130% of the federal poverty level. For these children, the program provides a daily nutritious meal that they might otherwise not have, and the benefit is clear and significant. The program reaches approximately 30 million children per day during the school year, the majority of them qualifying for free or reduced price meals. The children who receive less benefit are those in families above the income threshold for free or reduced price meals who nonetheless face food insecurity. The federal poverty level is a blunt instrument that does not accurately capture the financial circumstances of families in high-cost areas, where a family earning 200% of the federal poverty level may still struggle to afford adequate food. These families are paying full price for school lunch, or choosing not to participate because the full price is unaffordable, or accumulating debt that leads to the lunch-shaming practices that have attracted national attention. The administrative cost of the means testing system is substantial. Schools must collect income information from families, verify eligibility, manage accounts for paying students, and navigate the complex rules governing free, reduced price, and full-price meal categories. The administrative burden falls on school staff, on families who must complete eligibility applications, and on the federal and state agencies that administer the program. Studies have found that the administrative cost of means testing in the school lunch program is significant, potentially consuming a meaningful fraction of the program's total cost. Against this administrative cost, the benefit of means testing is the targeting of federal resources toward the children most in need rather than providing universal benefits to all children regardless of need. This is the standard argument for means testing in social programs. Universal programs are less cost-effective than targeted programs because they provide benefits to people who do not need them. The counterargument, which the pandemic experience and the experience of states with universal program supports, is that the efficiency gain from targeting is smaller than it appears when the administrative costs of means testing are properly accounted for, and that the negative consequences of means testing, including stigma, reduced participation, and the exclusion of families just above the threshold, offset much of the apparent efficiency gain. The evidence from the pandemic-era universal program and from the states that have continued it suggests that universal programs can be administered more efficiently than means-tested ones because they eliminate the eligibility determination and account management overhead that consumes significant administrative resources. The savings from reduced administration can offset a significant portion of the cost of providing meals to children who would otherwise be paying full price. The stigma question is more difficult to quantify, but no less important. The research on lunch-related stigma is clear. Children who receive free lunch report feeling embarrassed, identified as poor, and different from their peers who pay for lunch. This stigma affects not just the emotional experience of school, but the academic and social outcomes of the affected children. Children who are embarrassed by their lunch status are less likely to participate in school activities, more likely to be anxious and withdrawn, and more likely to experience the social exclusion that is one of the consequences of visible poverty in a school setting. A universal program eliminates this stigma because there is no distinction between children based on their payment status. Every child receives the same meal on the same terms, and no information about family income is visible to peers, teachers, or cafeteria staff. The states that have implemented universal programs report that participation increases, stigma-related behaviors decrease, and the administrative relationships between schools and families become simpler and less contentious. These benefits are real, and they are not captured in the cost-benefit analyses that focus solely on the direct cost of providing meals to children who would otherwise pay full price. A full accounting of the costs and benefits of universal versus means-tested school lunch would need to include the administrative costs of means testing, the participation losses from stigma and administrative barriers, the social and emotional costs of lunch-related stigma, and the long-term educational and health benefits of improved participation in a nutritious school meal program. When these broader costs and benefits are considered, the case for universal free school lunch is significantly stronger than the simple comparison of program costs would suggest. The teacher in Chicago in 1932 did not do a cost-benefit analysis when she kept crackers in her desk drawer. She saw children who were hungry, and she fed them. The analysis she conducted was simple. Hungry children cannot learn. Feeding them helps them learn, therefore feeding them is the right thing to do. The National School Lunch Act of 1946 translated this simple analysis into a federal program. The debates of the subsequent decades have been about how to structure that program in ways that reach the children who need it, minimize the stigma and administrative burden, and manage the cost. The pandemic experience showed that universal free lunch answers these questions better than the means-tested alternative. Whether the federal government will make that answer permanent is the question that the current political moment is facing. From the Chicago classroom in 1932 to the National School Lunch Act in 1946 to the universal free lunch of 2020 to the ongoing debate of 2025. The history is clear, the right answer is visible, the political will to act on it is still being gathered. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The numbers that make this history concrete are worth stating clearly one more time, because they connect the abstract policy debate to the specific children who are affected by it. Approximately 30 million children participate in the National School Lunch Program on a typical school day. Of these, approximately 22 million receive free or reduced-price meals, meaning that roughly 3/4 of participating students are eating at below market cost because their families cannot afford to pay full price. The remaining approximately 8 million pay full price, averaging approximately $3 to $4 per meal, depending on the school district. An estimated 13 million American children live in food-insecure households. These children are not all below the income threshold for free school lunch, because the income threshold does not perfectly correspond to the actual experience of food insecurity. Some food-insecure children are in families whose income is above the free lunch threshold, but who still struggle to afford adequate food in high-cost areas, or in months when unexpected expenses strain the family budget. The approximately 3,000 school districts that participate in the Community Eligibility Provision, a program established in 2010 that allows high-poverty schools to provide universal free meals to all students without collecting income information, serve approximately 18 million students. These schools, which must have high enough rates of direct certification eligibility to qualify for the provision, have demonstrated that universal free lunch is administratively feasible and that it produces the participation and nutritional benefits that advocates have claimed. The 8 states that have established universal free school lunch using state funds are doing so at a combined additional cost of approximately $2 to $3 billion annually above federal program costs. This investment represents a policy judgment by those states that the benefits of universal free lunch, in terms of child nutrition, administrative simplicity, reduced stigma, and improved educational outcomes, are worth the additional cost. The federal cost of extending universal free school lunch to all students nationally is estimated at approximately $15 billion annually above current program costs. This is a significant amount, but not a large fraction of the federal budget. The question is whether the political will exists to make this investment at the federal level, as 8 states have already done at the state level. The children who would benefit from federal universal free school lunch are not only the children who currently qualify for free meals. They include the children in working-class families above the income threshold who currently pay full price or go without. They include the children in families whose income fluctuates, who may qualify for free lunch in some months and not in others. They include the children who are eligible for free lunch, but whose families have not completed the paperwork to establish eligibility. And they include the children who are eligible but do not participate because of stigma. These are real children. They are hungry in real classrooms. And the solution to their hunger is not complicated. It is lunch. From the Chicago classroom in 1932 to the National School Lunch Act in 1946 to the pandemic-era universal free lunch of 2020 to the ongoing debate about whether to make it permanent. The teacher who kept crackers in her desk drawer knew what the right answer was. The question has always been whether the political system would catch up to what the teachers already knew. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. One more observation about this history before we close. It concerns the relationship between school lunch and educational outcomes, and specifically the research evidence that has accumulated over the decades since the National School Lunch Act was passed. The research on school lunch and academic performance is extensive and consistent. Studies conducted across multiple countries and multiple decades consistently find that children who eat school lunch show better academic performance than comparable children who do not, even when controlling for family income, parental education, and other factors that affect educational outcomes. The mechanism is straightforward. Children who are not hungry can concentrate better, retain information more effectively, and participate more actively in classroom activities than children who are hungry. The specific research on the American School Lunch Program has found effects on attendance, academic performance measured by standardized tests, and longer-term outcomes including high school graduation rates and adult earnings. A comprehensive study published in 2020, which used the expansion of the school lunch program in the 1960s and 1970s as a natural experiment, found that children who had access to school lunch performed significantly better on cognitive assessments in adulthood and had higher earnings than comparable children who did not have access to the program. The long-term economic return on the investment in school lunch was estimated to substantially exceed the cost of the program. These research findings are important for the policy debate because they establish that school lunch is not simply a welfare program that transfers resources to poor families. It is an investment in human capital that produces economic returns over the long run. A child who can concentrate in school because they are not hungry learns more, achieves better educational outcomes, and is more economically productive as an adult. The economic benefit of that productivity accrues not only to the child and their family, but to the broader economy in the form of higher tax revenues and lower social program costs. This investment framing, which echoes the arguments that progressive reformers made in the early 20th century when they were trying to win political support for school feeding programs, is relevant to the current policy debate. The question of whether to fund universal free school lunch is not simply a question about how much to spend on poor children. It is a question about the return on investment from a program that produces measurable economic benefits over the long run. The states that have chosen to fund universal free school lunch have implicitly made this investment judgment. They have decided that the economic and educational benefits of ensuring that every child in their state eats lunch at school outweigh the additional cost of providing that lunch universally, rather than through means testing. The experience of those states will eventually provide evidence that either confirms or challenges that judgment. The federal debate about universal free school lunch is the same investment debate at a larger scale. Whether the federal government will make the same judgment that 8 states have already made depends on whether the political conditions can be created that allow a $15 billion investment in child nutrition to be understood as an investment rather than as a cost. The teacher in Chicago in 1932 understood this implicitly. She kept crackers in her desk because hungry children cannot learn. The federal government took 14 years to catch up to what she already knew. The question is whether it will take another 14 years or another 78 years to catch up to what the states with universal free lunch are demonstrating today. From the Chicago classroom in 1932 to the National School Lunch Act in 1946 to the universal free lunch of the pandemic years, to the ongoing investment debate of 2025. That is the history. The investment case is clear. The children are waiting. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The last word on this history belongs to the children, because the history is ultimately about them. A child who sits in a classroom in 2025 without having eaten breakfast or lunch is experiencing the same impairment that the child in the Chicago classroom in 1932 experienced. The hunger is the same. The difficulty concentrating is the same. The embarrassment when it exists is the same. The gap between what that child could learn and what they are actually learning is the same. The federal government has been aware of this problem since at least the 1890s, when the settlement house workers began documenting it in the urban neighborhoods where they worked. It has had a federal school lunch program in place since 1946. It has had the evidence, accumulated over decades of research, that school lunch improves educational outcomes. And it has had, since 2020, direct experience of what universal free school lunch looks like and what it produces. The remaining question is not what the right answer is. The right answer is visible in the research, in the pandemic experience, and in the 8 states that have chosen to implement it. The remaining question is whether the political will exists to translate what is known into what is done at the federal level. That political will is built by understanding the history of how we got here, by recognizing the generations of children who went hungry in American classrooms before and after the 1946 Act, and by demanding that the federal government finally catch up to what the teachers, the researchers, and the states that have implemented universal free lunch already know. From the teacher in Chicago in 1932 with crackers in her desk drawer, to the National School Lunch Act in 1946 that gave her students a better answer, to the pandemic-era universal free lunch that gave every student the same answer on the same terms, to the ongoing debate about whether to make that answer permanent. The children are still waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. Subscribe if you want to keep following this kind of history. There is more ahead. One final number. In 2022, when the pandemic-era universal free lunch ended and schools returned to the means-tested system, approximately 2,000 school districts reported increases in student lunch debt within the first month. Children whose families had been receiving free lunch during the pandemic were now accumulating debt because their families could not afford the full price, or because the families had not yet completed the eligibility application process that the return to means testing required. The children who went hungry because of that administrative transition did not go hungry because their families suddenly became poorer between June 2022 and September 2022. They went hungry because a policy decision was made to return to a system that requires proof of poverty as a condition of eating lunch at school. That policy decision was made by adults. It can be unmade by adults. The question is whether enough adults are paying attention to what it costs the children who are affected by it. From 1932 to 1946 to 2020 to 2022. From crackers in a desk drawer to a federal program to universal free lunch to lunch debt in 2,000 school districts. The history is not complicated. The solution is not complicated. The children are not complicated. They are hungry, and they are waiting. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is more ahead.